health, psychology, and human nature with André Sturesson. Hey friends, hope you're having a great day. Are you following me on Instagram and Facebook? Please go to Health, Psychology and Human Nature on Instagram or Facebook, or both for that matter, to get the latest episodes, inspiration and more. Please take a pause and go there. Also, if you like the episode, please share it with a friend, family member, or somebody else who you think might like it. Welcome friends to another episode of Health, Psychology and Human Nature with André Sturesson. A science-focused podcast where we explore, learn and improve our lives together. Friendships are essential and more important than we think. That is something that becomes clear in today's episode with Science Journalist Lydia. Lydia, she explains how friendships affect our brainwaves, our genome, our cardiovascular system, our immune system, longevity, and a lot more. Friendships are also very important in evolutionary terms. It increases how long we live and the health of our offspring. To learn more, please check out Lydia's book Friendship, The Evolution, Biology and Extraordinary Power of Life's Fundamental Bond. Lydia Denworth is a contributing editor at Scientific American. Her work has also appeared in The Atlantic, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Time, Newsweek and many other publications. Friends, please enjoy. Lydia, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited about it. I think friendships it's one of those big topics that really affects our health and a lot of different things. So I'm really glad to have you on to discuss your new book.
Well, thank you. Yes, it's friendship is such an essential topic, but I think that a lot of us think we know all about it and we maybe take it for granted a little bit. And that's what I'm hoping to change.
Yeah. And the title of it is Friendship, the Evolution, Biology and the Extraordinary Power of Life's Fundamental Bond. And I thought that we perhaps could start off with evolution, if that's all right with you.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps we could start off just from an evolutionary perspective. Why do we have friendships?
We have friendships because connecting with other individuals is a positive thing for our health and therefore for our longevity. And so evolutionary biologists have two main measures. One is, the most important one is your reproductive success. So do you have children and are they healthy? And I mean, this is very, very simplistic in some ways, right? But evolutionary biologists look across species, so not just at humans, but at monkeys and apes and all kinds of other species. And they look at what contributes to reproductive success and then also what contributes to longevity, how long individuals live. And what we have found in the last 20 years, really, is that the strength of social bonds is one of the most important predictors of how long individuals live and of their reproductive success. Now, that is measured in monkeys and apes because there you can measure it. But in humans, so we don't measure the reproductive success, but longevity we do. And we have found that people with the strongest social bonds live the longest and are the healthiest. They're also happiest. But so there is this just fundamental need to belong that we all have. And one of the ways that we can satisfy it is through having really good, strong friendships.
That is very interesting. So basically, when you're studying apes and monkeys, what we've seen in studies is that those that have the best friendships, social bonds, they live longer and they have more offspring, basically.
Right. They have more offspring and healthier offspring. Their offspring are more likely to live a long time themselves, and then they live longer. So baboons and apes and rhesus macaques, other kinds of monkeys, they tend to hang out with family because that tends to be who's around. But what happens is those animals that don't have close relatives nearby or who've lost them, say, to a leopard attack or a lion, they will work to develop strong bonds with other animals. And what matters most is the quality of the bonds that they have, not the origin. So, meaning that a friend is as good as a relative in those situations. And so that is fascinating because it's the exception proves the rule that, we always think that family comes first. And of course, family is incredibly important. But what it tells us is that a quality relationship is the most important thing that we need for our health and longevity. And the relationship that I think most often, shows that quality is your best friendship, because those relationships are positive. They make you feel good, and they don't always bring the potential toxicity. Let's face it. I mean, sometimes our family are our closest. We have the closest bonds with our family, and sometimes it's not so great.
Yeah,
so,
you don't choose your family, right?
So you don't choose your family, you choose your friends, and the ones you choose are, usually because you enjoy their company, they make you feel good, they're there for you when you need them, they're a support. And so one of the things I think is really interesting is that I feel like all of this new science of friendship that's out there now shows that friendship can be something of a template for all other relationships. It's an example of how we ought to do it. If you think of your best friends and how you are with them, that is the kind of relationship that you need.
I think it's fascinating what you said there earlier, that it seems like that the relationship doesn't matter. I mean, it's if it's somebody in your family or if it's a friend.
Yeah, what's interesting is that this science blurs the lines between family and friends in some ways. There are other ways in which it's clear that there are differences, but I think about, I assume this is true in Sweden too, but here in the United States, a lot of people like to describe their spouse as their best friend. And that's lovely. But the reason we do that is to add to the description of the relationship something very, very qualitative, right? And to say that a friend is someone with whom you have a positive, supportive, reciprocal, long-lasting relationship. And those elements can be found in family relationships and non-family relationships. And so when it comes to health, the most important thing is that quality of the bond. And a friend can give it to you just as well as anyone else.
Right. Yeah. Now I understand. Yeah, exactly. So it's the friend aspect of the relationship. So it doesn't matter if if you share the same genetics. It's the quality.
Exactly.
It's the quality of the bond which makes it a friendship or not. So you can have a relative who is not your friend, or you can have a relative that is your friend. And yeah,
exactly. And most of us have. So you can think of friendships as kind of concentric circles. And we have a few people that we're very, very close to. The average for most of us is 4. But say anywhere from 2 to 6, 8 people, maybe 2 to 6, let's say. And that's your inner circle, right? If you think of yourself at the center of a bunch of concentric circles, that's your inner circle. And the average is that half of those people are relatives, blood relatives, and half are not. But it doesn't really matter which they are as long as you've got some people in that inner circle. And those are the people to whom you're going to devote most of your time. But not all of it, because then you go out and you continue these concentric circles out. And, the next circle is maybe 10 to 15 people that you really care about. They're the people you might invite to your birthday party first or something like that. Yeah. And then, then you go out further. And the further you get, maybe the fewer relatives you'll find, although also if you happen to have a big extended family, they might be out on those outer rims of the circles, right? Because you just don't have time, or you don't see. I mean, my extended family doesn't live near me, so I think we're friendly, but they're not the people I'm going to call, most of them, in an emergency. And that is one of the fundamental definitions of friendship is this someone that you could call if you needed help or if you needed support? And actually, let me just add, you asked, we were talking about the evolutionary piece of it. So if you look at in evolution, what happens is that the tendencies, the traits and behaviors that help us, survive and have babies are the things that tend to continue, right? And to get passed along. Yeah. And so the theory here is something like a survival of the friendliest is what has happened. that people,
I like that.
People, right? And that back in the, with early man, but also with animals, you see the same patterns, right? And so that ability, as we started to kind of hang out with larger groups of individuals, we needed to be able to navigate that, and we needed to know who we could count on. And that is still what friendship is today. Who can you count on?
And that is also something that I think a lot of us have heard a lot about, like that a lot of people don't have somebody to call if in need, or that there's a lot of people who doesn't have any close friends at all. And that is also quite interesting. Have you looked into the science? Yes, because what have you found?
Right. So, well, one of the thing that people have been talking about and that has been in the media is how bad for us loneliness is. And that is absolutely true. That's where in some ways, that's where the health side of friendship starts, is when you look at the negative, when you feel lonely and you are missing connection in your life. Those people have all kinds of health problems. They have cardiovascular problems. They have higher stress responses, and they have immune system changes. They have sleep problems. They have depression issues, things like that, mental health issues. And so, but loneliness, importantly, can mean different things to different people. When psychologists talk about loneliness now, usually what they mean is that the level of social connection that you have, it does not satisfy you. It's not what you want, right? Does what you have equal what you wish you had? Because some people are less social, and I'm not actually saying that everybody has to have 20 great friends and go to big parties all the time and things like that. What you need to do is find the kind of social connection that satisfies you and makes you happy. And so for some people, that's just one or two very close friends, and that's fine. But there are a lot of people who either don't have even that level of connection or who feel lonely in a crowd. I mean, it's possible to be with a lot of people but not feel particularly connected to them. And so loneliness is really the mismatch between what you have and what you want when it comes to personal connection. So the people who meet the psychological definition of loneliness, those are the people who have the health problems that come with it.
Exactly. And also an increased risk, right?
Yes.
An increased risk for all sorts of different kind of negative outcomes.
They very, very much so. If you are a lonely person, the risk is right up there with smoking. The risk to your health and longevity is right up there with smoking and obesity and other things that we recognize all the time as public health issues. We don't think of friendship as a public health issue, but it is. And so what I wanted to do with my book is people have heard this information about loneliness, but I wanted to flip it around and say, well, but then let's look at what friendship gives us, not just how loneliness hurts us, but look at both sides of the coin. So my book covers a whole lot about loneliness and how we know. I mean, that is how we figured out that social connection has a biological effect. But the argument is, though, then you've got to go out and figure out how to connect. You should prioritize it too. I mean, I think that social connection and friendship is as important as diet and exercise. in how we prioritize our time.
Right. Well, what makes you say that?
Because the science is so clear that social connection really it shapes our biology. It affects how long we're going to live. And so what I think people do is, especially in the middle of your life, if you've got a busy career, maybe you have a family, maybe you have both, we have a tendency to ditch our friends or to say we're too busy. They're the first thing to go when we're really busy. And I'm guilty of this as much as anyone. But now I really I see that we need to prioritize the people that we care about, and that I think it will help us in understanding that to make the choice to maybe have dinner with a friend, even when you've got something important to do for work, or you need to balance your time with your family. But spending that time with a really good friend and keeping that relationship going in a strong way is going to be a very important thing for your health long term and for your satisfaction. And so you should understand that. You shouldn't feel that it has to come last in your schedule. And
I think also that is something that, me and I guess everybody who's listening also can feel intuitively. When you're hanging out with somebody who you really like and who really likes you, a friend, it creates so much positive emotions, and you feel great. And
it does. It does. There's a chemistry to friendship, just like there's a chemistry to romance. We are attracted to people we want to be friends with. And then, of course, we like it if they like us back.
Yeah. Exactly.
And that doesn't happen with everyone. And that's one of the interesting things about friendship is that, the scientists have these technical terms for it. They say it's a differentiated relationships, but so it means that, I like this person better than that person. And that's okay. I'm going to spend more time with this person. I'm not saying you should be rude to the other person, but, that is what friendship is. It's we're more partial to some people than others. And that just has to do with a kind of natural liking and some similarity in our interests and especially our view of the world turns out to be one of the most important things that we find similar. But so one of the things I love is that just recently neuroscientists have discovered that you process the world in your brain very similarly to the way that your friends do. So, and by that, I don't just mean like you tend to laugh at the same things. You actually, the way your vision and your hearing work is much more similar. So let's say you're all watching video clips. You and your closest friend are more likely to process the visual and hearing parts of the video clips, to pay attention to the same parts, as you're going to be more similar than your friend, than people that you are not as close to, who are, say, three steps removed from you, and that I don't know if I explained that very clearly.
Yeah, and I understood. Yeah, that is fascinating, though. But that also makes sense. People who hang around with each other a lot, they seem to become
more similar. Well, that's actually what they're doing with this science right now. So I had to turn in my book before all of this research was done, but they figured out that there's this similarity in brain processing all across the brain, much more broadly than you might have thought. But what they don't know is how much is that there before you get to know someone. So like, are you drawn to people who process the world the way you do, and then you become friends because that's already there? Or does spending time together cause you to begin to process the world more similarly? And so that research is happening right now. And what they're doing is at a university, they took a whole group of people who showed up in a graduate school program, and they followed them for a whole year. But they scanned their brains before they met anybody, and then they're following them to see who they become friends with, and then they're scanning everybody again, and then they'll see what kind of change they find, and they think they can predict who's going to become friends with who, but they can also see whether their brains become even more similar the more time they spend together. And it probably is both things.
Has this been done? Has this been done?
It's being done.
It's being done.
Right.
Wow,
Done.
That's a very good study, an interesting study.
Isn't it? It's fascinating. And I do not know the answer. I don't know what they will find, but I do suspect, and the researchers suspect, that it will be some of both, that you are drawing people who are more like you to begin with, but then the more time you're together, the more similar you become.
Yeah. I think that is also something you see with couples as well. I mean,
yes,
that is a typical thing, that when two people who have spent 25 or 30 years of their life, they're basically they're not the same, but they're more similar than two random people for sure. I mean, yes,
I think that is true. We even say that here about people and their dogs. They start to look like their dogs.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true, but sometimes it feels that way. But anyway, it's so, friendship is this. There's this basic chemistry and liking that's at the core of it that then makes you feel good. I mean, we anticipate and we are rewarded in our brains, as everybody knows, by behavior and activity that makes us feel good. And that's, why friendship is such a pleasure. But our bodies kind of set us up to want that, because ultimately we're going to need it when we have problems. And, that is, in fact, as I've said, that's kind of what it's for. It's about setting up this little core group of shoulders to cry on, so to speak.
Exactly, and in evolutionary terms, I think, it must have been even more important. I mean, now we're not under the same kind of threats, probably, as we were back then. Maybe we also have threats, of course, but it feels like it should be something even more important back then.
It's simpler to see when the threats are lions and leopards and things like that. And it makes perfect sense that a group of baboons, for instance, in whom a lot of this work has been done, will band together and they have a better chance of surviving if there's a lion around, if they're in a group, than if they're alone, right? Obvious. The other thing, though, there's another fundamental, in addition to avoiding predators, the other thing that in animals is really important is that having good friends or being in a group makes it easier to find food. So, those are critical things. I love evolutionary biologists call it making a living in the savannah of Africa, but it's true.
Yeah,
they have to find food, and they have to spend a whole lot of time doing that, especially in places where the climate is difficult. But so those two things, protecting against predators and finding food, were really essential for all kinds of species, and they are things where almost always having, strong bonds and friends, we'll call them, around you makes those things easier. For humans today, it's easy to see the parallels, some days it feels like the lion is at your door, right?
Yeah.
Life gets hard. Hard things happen.
Yeah, for sure.
And, and our body responds to those things with the same kinds of changes in hormones and things like that happen if you were actually threatened physically. I guess maybe a speeding car is the equivalent of being attacked by a lion. But when we're under stress emotionally, we have similar physical responses, and a friend can literally reduce that level of response that we have and calm down our biological responses and help us then get through something, both emotionally and physically.
Yeah, it's not that the threats are not as acute now, but long term, of course, it's
right.
The effects are very real now as well, right?
Well, and this is actually one of the really interesting points. One of the ways that they began to understand that social connection was so important to health was that over time, as medicine has improved, as sanitation has improved, as we've had vaccines and things, people are much less likely to die young of infectious disease and things like that. What tends to kill us are these long-term chronic diseases, heart disease, cancer, things like that. And And it was only when you started in kind of in the middle of the 20th century and into the 60s and 70s when sociologists and epidemiologists and doctors started looking at what affects, what either causes or those kinds of diseases, or what makes people resilient against them, that they began to see that social connection mattered so much, right? It's not obvious. It seems completely obvious that if I go for a run, I get my muscles going, I get my heart rate going. You can imagine easily why that connects to your health, or what I put in my body when I eat and drink, right? It makes perfect sense. But a social relationship is entirely outside of the body. So why should that be able to get into our cells and our brain wiring and our genetics and have an effect? It wasn't obvious. And for a long time, when scientists studied relationships, they studied the ones where the connections were clearer, like mothers and infants, so childbirth is as physical, biological as it gets, and sex, right? And things like that. But a friend, what is a friend exactly? Like, first they had to define it and measure it. And it took a kind of a leap, and that only came about when the things that are most dangerous for us, the diseases, began to change.
That sounds very, very logical. And and about the friendships, because you mentioned a lot of different things here, and I would like to go into also the effect. So what would be like the biggest positive effects that you found that friendships has on us?
Well, we live longer, we're happier, we're even more successful, we're more, it's pretty much across the board that, having some good quality friendships in our lives leads to better things, better outcomes in life. And I'm not just talking about like how much money you make, although I think have even been studies that show that people with more friends tend to make more money, but I'm really interested in the biology of it, right? And and ultimately happiness. Fulfillment. We are so this theory of a need to belong. It sounds kind of like you would assume that that's obvious, but it wasn't until the 1990s. I'm blocking on the exact timing of this, but a couple of social psychologists got together and they were all thinking about like, what if there was one big master motive that kind of determines most of what people do, what would it be? Yeah. And a lot of them thought it was maybe something that's technically called terror management theory, but what it really is fear of dying. And they thought okay. everything we do must be determined by our fear of dying. Like, we're so afraid of it that it drives our behavior. And these social psychologists, Mark Leary and Roy Baumeister, they said, well, okay, yes, that's important. And we all have a fear of dying and it must have an effect. But they thought there must be something more mundane than that, really, more fundamental. And what they thought of is the thing is, if you're going to trash somebody else's theory, you have to have your own, right, to replace it. Yeah, and so they spent all this time talking. They stayed up late one night, like at this conference, and they said, we think that, what about a need to belong? Like, just literally the need to belong. And then they said, surely someone else has thought of this before. But they found that while belonging had been discussed, it had never really been looked at in the way that they were looking at it. And so they spent a whole lot of time then they wrote this famous paper on the need to belong that is now among the most cited scientific papers ever. It's in the top echelon of papers, because it was this kind of thing, was like hiding in plain sight. It was so obvious, and yet no one had articulated it before, that so much of what we do as people is driven by this need to belong and to feel included and to feel connected. And that's kind of where some of the work in friendship began as well, because then it makes sense that, why do we need friends? Well, because they make us feel like we belong. They make us feel connected.
And before you spoke about that friendship has an effect on biology and happiness. Could we talk a little bit about the biology? So what evidence is there? Like what does it affect when it comes to biology?
Well, it affects all kinds of things. So if I just give you a quick list, it's things like your cardiovascular system, so your blood pressure and your heart rate and all of that, your stress responses, your immune system, your sleep, your brain processing. But let me focus in on the part that I find so fascinating is that is the immune system. So just as an example of how friendship might affect your health. So we talked earlier about loneliness, and this research started with loneliness. So there was a psychologist named John Cacioppo who really pioneered the study of loneliness in a serious way. And he had studied college students, and then he studied elderly adults in Chicago, and he had blood samples from a lot of them. And then he was working on this loneliness work, and everybody was beginning to discover that loneliness was bad for your health. It affected your heart rate, it affected your sleep, it affected your mental health. So that's all fine. And then he met up with a guy who studies the genome and what happens, how your genes respond to the things that happen to you. We think all the time about how our genes determine a lot about who we are, but our experiences also determine a lot about who we are. And so your genes, the critical question about your genes is whether they're essentially turned on or off. That's what, when people talk about gene expression, they're really saying, is this gene activated or not activated in your lived experience? And essentially what they found is that when this psychologist studying loneliness and this geneticist, or a genomicist really, because he studies the whole genome, when they got together, they looked at the blood samples that they had from these elderly people in Chicago, and they knew which ones were the loneliest and which ones were the least lonely. And what they found was that if you looked at the way their gene expression worked in the immune system, the people who were the most lonely, their genes had literally expressed differently. So things that increased inflammation went up, and things that protected them against viruses went down. And it was the opposite in the other people who were not lonely. And so literally your experience of loneliness had gotten down into your cells and changed the way your immune system responded to a virus or to inflammation. And so now that shows you why loneliness is bad. Now the work that's going on is trying to really show, and let me just say too that in doing that work, the guy who's the genomicist, his name is Steve Cole. He's at UCLA in California, and he came to understand, like, he'd been interested in loneliness, but he thought, okay, it's an emotion, it's this or that, Yeah. What he has since found is that response, that change in the immune system in response to loneliness, is similar. You see it in people suffering extreme trauma and extreme poverty and other kinds of crises. And what Steve Cole will tell you is that doesn't mean that loneliness is not important. That you have this same, what it tells you is that loneliness is on a par with extreme crises and poverty and trauma in people's lives, that you have the same physical response from a lack of connection as you get from, like they studied things like child soldiers in Africa had the same physical response. And so now what he's trying to do is show whether the flip side more clearly, like how much does social connection improve the way your gene expression works in your immune system. And we see that it does, but it's some of that work hasn't been done as thoroughly. You have to have a whole lot of control groups. You have to have, but there are really interesting signs. So the last chapter of my book, so people are going to have to read all the way through to get to this. But in the last chapter, I went to Los Angeles and I hung out with these elderly women. They're African American women who are volunteering in local schools in Los Angeles. And this program is called Generation Exchange. It was in fact created by a researcher at UCLA who's interested in friendship and loneliness and has been studying. She's an epidemiologist, and she'd been studying all along how connection plays out in people's lives and how it affects their health across the lifespan. And she created this program, which looks like a volunteer program to help the kids in schools, and it is that. And she says to the older participants, this will be good for your health, which it is. And it's good for their health because they're more they're more active, they're moving, they're, engaged mentally. But what she was also doing was creating an anti-loneliness program, because if you can't just put people together in a room and say, okay, now be friends, right? It doesn't work that way. But if you bring them together around a project that everybody believes in and is a sort of shared passion, those relationships, those friendships are much more likely to grow up naturally. And so I went out and I spent time with these women, and they have become really good friends. And this one woman had literally panic attacks. She was so lonely and unhappy before. And then she's doing this project and she's in this program. And now her life has meaning. She has all these friends. She's got her best friend works in this program with her. She's very close to the teacher she works with, and she's very close to the children. And so she's got all these new kinds of relationships, and everybody's health is better. And even their immune systems, their gene expression in their immune systems is better than it was when they started. Now, let me just say the caveat there is that they did that measurement of their blood from when they started and when they, and then over the course of a year or two, and they saw this improvement, but they haven't tested it against larger groups or people in other kinds of programs. But all I can say is that it's tantalizing, and it makes it seem that kind of meaning and connection in these women's lives and the friendship, in part that comes from the friendships that they've got out of this, has had this effect of improving the way their immune systems respond.
Yeah, and it seems like that it really can have such an effect. I mean, it can be like an upward spiral.
Yes, that's right. It's all connected, right? It's not just one thing. But one thing I want to point out that's important is that a lot of people assume that depression leads to loneliness. But what the researcher I mentioned earlier, John Cacioppo, who's a psychologist who did all this work in loneliness, what he found was that, in fact, loneliness caused depression and not necessarily the other way around. And so I think it's really important to know that, and for people to understand that the problem can begin with the loneliness. And then, yes, you connect with people, you feel you're needed, you have the need to belong, right? These women in this program in Los Angeles feel they belong. There are kids waiting for them every day. They're peers who they work with, their friends, and they laugh and they talk about everything that they care about together, and they're so much better off. And a big piece of that is that they have this social connection.
Right. Have you seen, like, when it comes to depression, have you taken a look at like randomized controlled trials of some kind of friendships with depression?
Well, this work on depression and loneliness was done very rigorously, and I do think that it was randomized controlled trials. I'm having to remember, actually. I'm sorry, I'm blocking a little on the exact study I'm talking about, but I think that they proved quite definitively that the connection can go from loneliness to depression. Now, that doesn't mean that it never goes the other way, but what was important about that finding was that people needed to understand, like, a lot of people thought, well, loneliness just comes along for the ride with these other problems, right? And that is just not always the case. Often the problem begins with the loneliness. And so I don't know of brand new studies or brand new trials that are studying this particular connection. But the work that was done early on about it is considered pretty definitive.
Right. Do you know about so that is one place of the spectrum? So looking at mental health and looking at depression. Has there been any studies of well-being or quality of life or like the other part of the
right?
well-being?
So that's what's beginning to happen. There's beginning to be more rigorous study of well-being and of positive psychology, basically. Like how much does well-being then make you a healthier person? That work there's less of it, is my sense, but in fact, there's important work happening there that does show that there is a link between well-being and good health.
And about you mentioned the cardiovascular system before. So could you tell us a little bit about the effects on the cardiovascular system as well?
Yes. It was one of the first places where researchers found a connection between loneliness and physical health. And so in an early study, they looked at college students, young adults, and the lonelier young adults showed differences in a measure of cardiovascular function that's called TPR, for total peripheral resistance. And you don't really need to know exactly what it is, but it has to do with the way your arteries constrict, and resistance in the blood, in the arteries increases as arteries constrict, and as they dilate, resistance decreases. And so it's an early sign of potentially worrying cardiovascular function. So in these young adults who were lonely, they found signs that this piece of cardiovascular functioning wasn't working quite as well. Then what they did was they went and studied these much older adults, and in them they found that those who were loneliest had clear problems with their blood pressure. They had high blood pressure, and they had other problems with their cardiovascular functioning. And what they thought was that what they saw in the young adults was the beginnings of the problem, and then in the older adults who were lonely, you can see how it manifested and how over years of being lonely, they were worse off. The flip side would be that the positive, if you have positive social connection and you're not lonely, that all kinds of things work better. It probably, scientists use the term pathway to describe what are the mechanisms that make something happen. And we don't know all the answers for exactly what happens along the way, but it makes sense, for instance, that if you're less stressed, your heart rate goes down, your blood pressure goes down, and your friend can be the thing that makes you less stressed and calmer as you go through your day-to-day life. And that ultimately there's sort of a knock-on effect of keeping your cardiovascular system healthier.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking now what we were talking about before. It just seems like, if you have a lot of good social bonds, it just feels like it's something that really can affect stress and really can affect the cardiovascular system and your blood pressure and all that, because you probably feel calmer when you are more socially connected.
Yes, you do. And if you think about all of this, all the work that was done on loneliness and health, the people who were lonely showed one kind of effect, and the people who were not lonely did not. Right. Yeah. So that is a sign. It's indirect, but it tells you that social connection has this fundamental biological effect. Oh, and one of the effects I left out is that it's also protective cognitively. So you're more likely to suffer from dementia and things like that if you have less social connection.
This just makes me think, because you have really been researching a lot for this book. So what has been the most important thing that you've learned from writing this book?
The most important thing it really is so simple. It's just how incredibly important our relationships and our friendships specifically are. And I'm saying friendship there because, as we discussed earlier, I think of friendship as summarizing a quality bond, right?
Yeah.
A bond that makes you feel good, that's positive, that's reciprocal, that's involves. If you want to extend the definition, there's trust and loyalty and all those good things in there. But it's just how, and in fact, I've asked a lot of the researchers that I interviewed, what's your big takeaway? And that's what they all say, how important this really is. We kind of celebrate, like, especially here in America, there's a lot of celebration of the individual and that you need, you don't need anybody.
Yeah.
But that's not really true. It's just not true. You do need other people, and you need to put in the time and effort. I mean, one of the most interesting, I guess you asked me what feels most important. I can put it this way. One of the most striking things that anybody said to me was a longtime social epidemiologist. She did some of the early work on this, and then her name's Lisa Berkman. She's at Harvard, and she said to me, we need to be thinking about friendship and social connection all through our lives, and it's very much like when you're 65, it's like smoking. If you stop smoking at 65, it's still better than continuing to smoke, but damage will have been done. And she said friendships and relationships are the same. You need to be building them and working on them all through your life. And if you only start really focusing on it when you retire, say, or your kids are grown, that's still better than never focusing on it at all. But some damage will have been done. And I thought that was so profound.
Yeah, that is profound.
We don't think about friendship that way exactly. But what all this science and research is telling us is that we should.
That is such that is very, very interesting.
And there's another really important study done here of men from some men from Harvard and then some people from Boston, from poor neighborhoods in Boston. And they followed them over, like, say, 70 years of their lives. And when they were in their 80s, what they found is if you went back and looked at these same people in their 50s, the thing that best predicted how healthy and happy they were at 80 was the state of their relationships when they were 50.
Yeah, there's a TED Talk about that study as well, right?
There's a TED Talk about that study. Exactly. That study was done at Harvard, and the guy who runs it now is named Robert Waldinger. And he gave a wonderful TED Talk about this, and anybody can find it online. And it is just so, and he says, I mean, it's the same takeaway that I'm telling everybody here. How can we have known about all this for so long, and yet we don't really act like it's the most important thing in our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, for sure. I really like also in that TED Talk when he's talking about these two groups, either the Harvard students or the Boston, those who had
the kids from Boston,
exactly, had a harder upbringing. And I think it was so funny when he said that those from Boston never understood why they wanted to talk with them. Like, why do you want to talk with me? But the Harvard people, they fully understood. Like, yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm important.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's right. I think it was a lot of fun when he was talking about that.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. The whole thing is fascinating. I highly recommend that people dig into it a little bit because it really does send you away with some sort of thoughts about how best to live your life and what to focus on.
For sure. And also, I really liked this one before. Like, you can I mean, you can smoke your entire life, and then you can stop smoking when you're 65, and of course, then you will affect your health in a positive regard, but you still have probably done damage before. And it's the same thing with relationships, that you can, I mean, if you live isolated your entire life and you start having a lot of good social bonds when you become older, it's better, but you still had effects probably on both your biology and your your psychology as well.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And so it's so it's just so important that at every point in life we are thinking about this. And I know, as someone who has raised 3 kids and had a career and has a husband and, a busy life, and I am now have a mother who's not well, and, so I know all about the demands of life. But it has changed. Working on this book has changed a little bit how I operate with my own friends. Sometimes when maybe I would have canceled or not scheduled something, I think twice, and I think, do I really, really, need to cancel that, or can I do it? And it also has changed how I parent. It has really helped me to understand that friends matter for kids so fundamentally. And when you have teenagers, which I do, they, it can be annoying how much time they want to spend with their friends. And it's not always a great thing, but it is really important. They want to do that for very healthy, normal reasons. It's evolutionary. They need to be breaking away from their parents, and they need to be spending time with their peers, and they're learning a lot while they're doing that. They're getting all kinds of lessons in trust and loyalty and relationships, and they're going to want to do more of it than an adult thinks looks like the best use of their time. And so I've also sort of stopped myself, and I try to be less judgmental, and I try to ask when they're, what my son wanted to go spend the weekend with. He was entering his senior year in high school, so it was his last year with this group of friends that he was really tight with. And right before school started, they were all going to go away for the weekend to somebody's house, and he wanted to go, and I felt he couldn't go because he hadn't done all of his schoolwork that he needed to get done before the first day. We get summer work right before you go, and he had to study for the standardized tests that you have to take here in America to go to college. And he hadn't really done all the things he was supposed to do in the summer. And I felt that there should be consequences. He shouldn't get to go hang out with his friends. Yeah. And he said to me, I mean, my boys are, they took advantage of the fact that I was writing a book of friendship, right? He said, but mom, you say that friendship matters more than anything. And so I let him go. I made him stay home the first night and do more of the work. And then I let him take the train the next day and meet up with his friends. And he had a great time, and neither of us regretted it. So. Right.
That's the downside of writing about this stuff. He can always use that against you. Like, no, I don't have to do this, Mom. It's the most important thing, as you have said a couple of times, is that I just have to spend time with my friend.
Exactly. Of course, I say, well, you do have to do your homework. Believe me, not saying that there's not, but I do think that as parents, sometimes we have a little bit of an automatic reaction to things, and we should at least stop and reconsider and run it through the filter of friendship and say, what's the right decision here, and at least give friendship a little more weight. And the other thing I'll say about that is that, as we model for our kids what matters, what we think matters in life. And if all we're modeling is the importance of achievement and hard work and all of that, and if that's the thing we're always pushing them to do, and we're not pushing them to be good friends and spend time with their friends and work on their relationships, then we're not sending the right message entirely.
No, I think that is very true. So the biggest things that we learned, we all know it's important, but this is kind of really making us understand how important it is, that it's more important than a lot of us originally think.
Yes, I think so. It's a biological imperative. I mean, it's not a luxury. It's not just something that's nice to have and makes you feel good. It's a necessity. I don't know how many other words I can use. It's part of the infrastructure of being human is to have friends, and you need to work at it. It's important too to say time is a big deal in this question of friendship, both because time is limited for all of us and because, you have to put time in to your friendships to make them really work. In fact, I found a guy who did research. He actually counted up the number of hours. So you need to spend about 50 hours with someone before they go from being an acquaintance to a friend. And it takes about 200 hours of togetherness to consider someone a best friend. And no matter how much you like them when you first meet, you don't make that jump without putting in the time. And so, of course, you can't spend that kind of time with everyone. That's why, your friends are the people that you sort of make the choice to spend more time with. And so I'm not saying that you have to try to treat everyone the same way, but you do have to recognize that friendship takes time and that it's worth your time, that people are worth your time, and it's an investment in your health, in your longevity, and in your happiness.
And also, I think this can also be related just to what you think about life. About what life is all about.
It really is. And so, one of the things that I found so interesting is that I mentioned that people didn't study this in this serious way for a long time. And so philosophers talked about friendship. In fact, Aristotle talked about friendship a lot and was very wise about friendship, but not a whole lot of attention was paid. But since Aristotle, from between Aristotle and now, that's not entirely true, but less than you might think, people talking about it. But one of the writers is the British writer C.S. Lewis wrote that friendship was like philosophy and art. It doesn't have survival value, but it's one of the things that gives value to survival. Yeah. Well, the last part is true. It does. It gives value to survival. But now what we know is that it actually has survival value in the most literal sense as well. And so, C.S. Lewis, all due respect, but you were wrong. And so, this is an important thing for us to understand. We have to take it to another level and treat it with more respect.
For sure. So when you were writing this book as well, have you also given any thought to how to improve your friendships?
Yes. So one of the things is putting in the time. Like I said, understanding that friendship takes time and that it's worth your time. Another is treating people well and treating people the way you want to be treated. And this is something that's interesting in when you think about the lines between family and friends, say. And I think about how I might snap at my husband for the way he loads the dishwasher, and I would never do that to a friend. And sometimes I think, maybe I should pull a little bit more of my friendly behavior into some of my family relationships. But another really important thing, I think, is showing up, which is related to the question of putting in the time. But I talked about how in evolutionary science, we see that friendship and connection is about building bonds so that you have people there when you need them. And the thing to remember is that it's reciprocal. So just like you want people to show up for you, you need to try to show up for them.
Yeah.
And, I think that some of us do that really well, or sometimes we do that really well, and other times we don't. And I just urge people to sort of stop and think again about whether they are doing the best that they can to be a truly good friend to the people they care about.
Right. And I think that's a very good note to end this interesting discussion with, about that it is really important to really be a good friend. And I would like to say a big thank you for coming on. And it's been a fascinating conversation, I think. And it's, as I said in the beginning, this is really one of the most important subjects for so many different things. So big thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you so much for your interest, and I'm glad that you find it interesting, and I hope you will call a friend.
I will immediately, right now.
Immediately, right now.
Okay.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank you. All
Bye.
Right. Bye-bye.
A rating and a review is a great thing, but if you will start to subscribe, you will make my heart sing. Have a great one, friends.